Okay, so thank you for including me. I'm happy to be here. I think this is a great program, and it's really nice to see many people again in person. Um, so on that, let me get started. So this is a paper on the impact of health inequality on lifetime earnings inequality. That's joint with Rusbe and Kai. Okay, so you know, as Svetlana kind of already talked about a bit, poor health impacts individuals through several channels. It can lead to lower labor productivity, increased utility costs of working, increased mortality risk, and in the U.S., increased medical expenses, increased out-of-pocket medical expenses. It also increases the chances in the U.S. of accessing disability, in particular disability social insurance programs, so like supplemental Social Security income and Social Security disability insurance. And if you just look at raw correlations in the data, individuals in poor health have lower earnings and labor supply in the U.S. So, what we want to do is our question is, how important is health inequality for lifetime earnings inequality? And what we're particularly interested in this paper is the relative importance of the fact that people who are in poor health have a higher chance of getting onto these social insurance programs. So this may incentivize them to exit the labor market and try to get onto these programs, versus that they face a higher utility cost and lower labor productivity if they work. And so how do we go about doing this? So we do three things in the paper. First, we construct an objective measure of health, which is the Frailty Index. I'll talk more about it in a moment, but it's essentially the cumulative sum of all past adverse health events. We think for this question that we're after, it's especially important to use an objective measure of health because subjectivity bias is larger when you look at like the disability insurance population. These people are more likely to say they're in bad health, in part to justify that they're receiving disability insurance benefits. But I think there's several other benefits of using a measure like this that I won't go into much detail on. We actually have a related paper that does an extensive analysis of this measure of health and compares it to other measures like self-reported health status. Okay, and then in the second part of the paper, we do an empirical analysis. It's a dynamic panel estimation using the PSID data where we estimate the effect of health on current earnings. And then we assess the importance of the relative channels through which health impacts current earnings. So basically the impact in hours, wages, and participation. And we do this because we want to make sure that in the model, we get the channels right. And in the empirical analysis, what we find is that the effect of health on current earnings is quite large, and it primarily comes through the participation channel. I'll show you that. And then finally, we build a model that's consistent with these findings. Agents in the model are going to have heterogeneous and risky health profiles or frailty profiles, and we're going to then use this model to assess the impact of health inequality and lifetime earnings inequality and the importance of the different channels. And a quick preview, we find that health inequality accounts for 30% of lifetime earnings inequality at age 65, 2/3 of which is due to the fact that people in poor health have higher probability of getting on SSDI and SSI programs. And then in the very end, we do a welfare analysis, and we find that, despite the fact that health inequality increases lifetime earnings inequality, and a large reason it increases lifetime earnings inequality is because people in poor health, are able to get onto these programs. These programs are ex-ante welfare improving. So agents in our model value them despite this. Okay, so how do we measure health? So we're using this Frailty Index. It's the cumulative sum of all adverse health events. You can think of these as deficits. It was first proposed in the gerontology literature where it's widely used. So the type of deficit variables that are used to construct this index in PSID include things like, do you have difficulties with activities of daily living, such as eating, dressing yourself, using the phone, etc. There's a whole series of questions about diagnoses. Have you ever been diagnosed with heart disease? Have you ever been diagnosed with psychological problems? Have you ever been diagnosed with dementia? So on. And then we also include some body measurements, like whether you have BMI over 30. And so basically, we assign a value of 1 whenever you have one of these conditions, in the sense that it's a deficit, and 0 otherwise. And we add them all up and normalize the value to be between 0 and 1. So basically, yeah, I think there's something like 27 deficit variables. If you have 13 of them, your frailty index is 13 over 27. Equal weighting is not essential to this. Like I said in the other paper, we also do principal component weighting and other weighting schemes as well. Okay, and so here's some information about how frailty looks in the PSID for household heads and spouses ages 25 to 94. And so first, see that mean frailty increases with age. Those are the black circles in these in this plot, and decreases with education. It's kind of interesting that there's much more variation in frailty by education than, for example, by gender. The cross-sectional distribution is highly right skewed, both overall and by age. So you can kind of see that here. Here's the overall cross-sectional distribution. And here you can see from these box plots the distributions within these 10-year age groups. The distribution's highly skewed for 2 reasons. One, a large fraction of people have 0 frailty. It's about 24% of the 25 to 34-year-old age group. It declines to less than 1% for 85 plus. The other reason is that even at young ages, there's a thin right tail of very unhealthy people. And then you see that there are, both positive and negative changes in frailty wave over wave. So some people's health does improve. Frailty declines, meaning their health improves about 13% of the time, and 29% of the time it deteriorates. The rest of the time there's no change. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, we haven't really looked at that, actually. And I'm trying to remember if we control I think we do controls for cohort effects, but we haven't actually looked to see how frailty varies across cohorts. It's an interesting thing, I think, to look at, to see if you could actually see some patterns, like maybe perhaps improving health as you move to later cohorts. But yeah, we haven't actually done that. Yeah, or the Yeah, it would be very interesting. I mean, one problem here is that in PSID, you can't construct a frailty index prior to 2001 because they don't ask most of the questions that you need to construct it. A lot of these health questions are not asked. So that kind of limits time series analysis with PSID. You might be able to do something better with HRS, also because you have larger samples in HRS. I mean, the downside there is that you're really looking only at their health at older ages, but that's where most of the health variation is, right? Because the variance in the cross-section increases with age. But yeah, I think that's an interesting thing to potentially do, but yeah, I haven't done it. Okay. So let's talk about the dynamic panel estimation. So we want to understand what is the effect of health measured by frailty on earnings, hours, and wages. So what we do is we estimate the following regression. So we're going to regress the log of either earnings, hours, or wages on a fixed effect, frailty, 2 lags of the left-hand side variable, a set of exogenous controls, and a shock. And here's your exogenous controls: marital status times gender, number of kids times gender, cubic and age, and year dummies. And we're doing this estimation. This is only for prime age, 25 to 64. And we're doing it with a Blundell-Bond system GMM estimator. Why are we using this fancy dynamic panel estimator? Well, we're concerned about the fact that, health is an endogenous, frailty could be endogenous, right? Earnings could impact frailty could impact health. These are both highly persistent variables. So past frailty could impact current earnings, past earnings could impact current health. And dynamic panel estimators are actually really designed for exactly this type of situation. They essentially use lagged values of the endogenous variables of frailty and these lagged earnings as instruments. They call them internal instruments to estimate, to kind of sort out the endogeneity problems and estimate a causal effect. And yeah, sorry, I should have clicked this. Yeah, and then I guess the other main reason is we need to control for fixed effects, and because we're concerned about unobserved heterogeneity, people who are just higher innate ability potentially have better health and better earnings. Okay, so we're going to focus on the gamma, which is what we're interested in, and I'm going to show you gamma divided by 27, which is the effect of one additional deficit, just to ease the interpretation. So we find that when an increase in frailty by one deficit reduces earnings by about 20%. This is for everyone. The effects are concentrated in less educated people and people who are already in poor health at the time that the shock occurs. And then we run the same regressions only for workers, and you can see we get the same patterns, but the size of the effects is substantially smaller. And so we conclude from this that this effect works primarily through the extensive margin. When people are in poor health, they exit the labor force. And these regressions kind of confirm that even more. So then we do the same thing for hours. We get similar pattern and magnitude of effects for everyone. If you condition just on workers, that we don't find anything. So we basically don't find any effects of deteriorations in health on hours on the intensive margin in the US. And then we look at wages. We do find some effects, but they're concentrated again in the less educated. So for high school dropouts, one additional deficit reduces wages by 7%. We don't see any effect here. I'm going to revisit this later. There's no control for selection here, so this is conditional on being a worker and staying in the labor market. Later, I'll do a version where I control for selection, and I'll add quadratic frailty effects, so that's coming. Okay, and then finally, we flip everything around just to see if we can find effects going in the other direction. So now we put frailty on the left-hand side and log earnings on the right-hand side, and we don't find much of anything. So we don't find evidence that there's effects going from earnings to frailty, which is largely consistent with the empirical literature. It's hard, it's hard even in the US to find effects of health, of earnings on health. They may be there for very specific select groups that we potentially wouldn't pick up in these regressions. But our view from this is that, our view from what we did and from the empirical literature is that these are not first order drivers of the kind of joint correlations of health and earnings over the life cycle. And so we're not going to build these effects into our model. Okay, so to summarize, we find that increases in frailty reduce earnings and hours. The effect primarily works for the employment margin and is concentrated in less educated and less healthy individuals. And these findings already suggest that health inequality may be an important source of lifetime earnings inequality, right? It's the fact that people in poor health exit the labor market at higher probabilities, then potentially they're going to have much lower lifetime earnings. And social insurance may play an important role given that they're exiting, which we know they need to do to get onto these social insurance programs like SSDI. And so now we want to quantify the impact of health inequality and lifetime earnings inequality and look at the various channels.
So you didn't do all the conditions for what you included in frailty, but in this topic was not in there as well. So for example, if I look at the young person, you got a lot of the condition like ADL limitation, diagnosis therapy. So if I look at the young person who has a one deficit versus 10, well, like one step difference with people. So what's the difference across them? Most of them don't have ADL limitation, don't have mechanical process. So what is corrected the difference for the young people between both the
So for what's important for young people are diagnoses variables, like diagnosed with diabetes, these types of things, and BMI, and I think we also include whether you smoked in the past, and so smoking is a variable that a lot of young people will say that they have smoked in the past. So I think those are the big ones. You can include self-reported health as well, and in that other paper we do a version where we included it. It doesn't really change things very much here because it's one of 27 deficits, and so none of these patterns change if you include that or not. But we just don't include it here because it's a subjective measure, and we wanted to kind of not add additional subjectivity bias to the measure here. Okay, so let's talk about the model. So it's a J period overlapping generations general equilibrium model. Individuals are going to be subject to exogenous shocks in their frailty, their labor productivity, and they're going to face a risk of getting separated from their job, so job separation shocks. It's going to be an annual period model, so a period is 1 year, and so we're going to model these separations as that basically if you get separated from your employer, you can pay a one-time wage cost and go back to work immediately in the next period, right? Because the average durations of unemployment are much shorter than 1 year. And frailty is going to impact individuals through 5 channels in the model: their labor productivity, their mortality, out-of-pocket medical expenses, disutility from working, and their probability of becoming a DI beneficiary. And so individuals in the model can be in one of 4 states. They can be employed. If they're young and employed, they can choose to switch to non-employment. We also allow older individuals to work. I'll show you why later. They can always choose to retire. Then there's non-employed individuals. The assumption in the model here is that if you're not working, it's because you're trying to get on DI. It's basically a model of men. So for the most part for men, individuals who are out of the labor market for a year, who are males, who are prime age, are for the most part trying to get on DI. And you can always choose if you don't get on DI, you can always choose to go back to the employment state. DI beneficiaries are pretty boring. They just collect their DI benefits until they hit retirement age, in which case they roll into old age Social Security. Retirees collect Social Security benefits and do not work. And so, we don't model exit from DI because the primary reasons people exit from DI is because they roll into retirement or they die. It's about less than 1% of people exit for reasons other than that. So it's basically an absorbing state. And then there's going to be a government in the model that's going to collect taxes on capital, income, and payroll and pay out old age Social Security, SSDI, and SSI benefits. Also, there's going to be a guaranteed consumption floor by the government, so they'll pay out means-tested transfers, and they finance exogenous government purchases. So here's the problem of a young employed individual. And so here's their state. Consists of their age, their assets, education, their frailty, which depends on their age and their education, and there's also going to be frailty shocks and a fixed effect. And then there's a productivity shock and a fixed effect, and their average past earnings. And also in their state is an indicator of whether they're returning from a separation, right? And so, current utility depends on consumption and frailty. This P is the probability of dying, which depends on age, frailty, and education. If the probability sigma, they get separated from their employer, in which case they can, let me show you the budget constraint. They can pay this one-time wage cost and return to work, or they can stay in non-employment. With probably 1 minus sigma, they don't get separated, and then they can always choose to go to non-employment, right? But part of the idea here is that like DI applications increase during recessions. So part of why we want to have these separation shocks is that when you lose your job, that might be a good time to say, well, I'm pretty I have pretty poor health. Maybe I should just go for disability instead of kind of paying this cost of getting back into employment. Yes, yeah. Yes, you have to choose to go to the non-employment state and to try to get on disability. If you don't go to the non-employment state, you won't ever get it, and that's always a choice. You can avoid that non-employment state if you want to. Yeah, once you're on DI, you can't go back, but the agents fully understand this. No, this is individuals. I mean, the model is calibrated to men, U.S. males. Okay. And the utility function is Cobb-Douglas in consumption and disutility from work. The disutility from work is increasing in frailty. Here's the functional form. And old employed individuals are similar to young employed individuals. The main difference is that now if you get separated from your employer, you can choose to pay the one-time wage cost or go to retirement, or you can always just decide to retire. Also, their medical expenses are different. We basically estimate different medical expense processes for them to account for the fact that they can get Medicare. And instead of getting, instead of getting labor earnings, they get their labor earnings if they're working, but we assume also we just give them their old age Social Security benefits, which there's no penalty for them other than maybe some tax implications for them getting these now. Okay. And then young non-employed individuals. So here now their state consists of the number of periods they've been in non-employment. So we allow the probability of getting on DI to depend not only on your frailty, but also the amount of time you've been trying to get on. And this is because we really want to make sure the model captures the expectation about the amount of time you'll spend in the non-employment rate trying to get on DI, since this has a big impact on your willingness to apply. And so with probability theta, they successfully get on DI and then they just stay there. With probability 1 minus theta, they can either stay in the non-employment state and try for DI again, or they can pay the one-time wage cost and go back to the employment state. And then for a DI beneficiary, so a DI beneficiary's now their state consists of the number of periods they've been on DI. We do this because you have to be on DI for 2 years to be eligible for Medicare. So we make the out-of-pocket medical expenses depend on whether you've been on DI for 2 years or not. And then, like I said, these guys, they just stay on DI until they hit retirement, and then they go to the retirement state. Okay, and I won't show you the retiree's problem. It's very standard. I'm going to move on to the calibration. So like I said, a period in the model is 1 year. Agents are going to live from age 25 to age 94, so 70 periods. And here's these 5 channels through which frailty affects individuals in the model. The first 2, survival and out-of-pocket medical expenses, are estimated outside the model using HRS and MEPS. I'm not going to go in more detail about those estimations. Labor productivity is estimated outside the model, now controlling for selection and allowing for a quadratic frailty effect. So I'll talk briefly about that. And then I'll talk about how we use, the other 2 kind of ways in which frailty impacts individuals is through this probability of successfully getting on DI and disutility of work, and impact on disutility work. I'm going to talk about how we use the model and the data to calibrate those 2 channels and separately identify them. Okay, but before I do that, let me just quickly talk about the frailty process that individuals face. So, like in the data, we're going to assume that a positive fraction of people in the model start with 0 frailty at age 25, and then each period, your frailty remains 0 with some probability that depends on your age and otherwise becomes positive. Once frailty becomes positive, we assume that log frailty is the sum of an age polynomial, a fixed effect, a transitory shock, and an AR1 shock. And, as I showed you in the beginning, frailty is very different by education. It's not just mean frailty that's different by education. The entire dynamics of frailty over the life cycle are very different by education. And so for this reason, we're going to separately estimate these frailty processes for each of these 3 education groups. And the other thing we're going to do is in that estimation, we're going to control for selection due to mortality. And this is because I'll show you that it's important if you're going to have people like over the age of 50 in your model to control for mortality selection when you estimate or calibrate health dynamics. And so to do that, the way we control for selection here is due to mortality is to we have an auxiliary simulation model. We basically simulate frailty and mortality risk, and then we're going to estimate that model with a simulated method of moments. So just to give you a sense of how that works, I'm just going to show you the frailty process for the high school graduates, which are the largest group in the model. So this is the fraction with 0 frailty in the model and the data. For this fraction, whether or not you control for mortality doesn't matter. The simulated, the red line is assuming no mortality risk, and blue is with mortality. You can see that they're not very different, and that's because by the time you get to these older ages where mortality really starts to matter, most people already have positive frailty. So the fraction with 0 frailty is very small. So here's mean log frailty, and this targets the age profile of frailty in the data. And then for the stochastic component, the targets are the variance covariance matrix. And we fit that pretty well. And here's what happens if you shut down mortality in the simulation model. This is what I was saying, that it's important to control for selection due to mortality. So you can see that without, if nobody dies, you get a much steeper increase in frailty with age, right? So if you were to ignore selection, you would substantially, right? So the red, you can think, the red is the kind of true frailty profile if nobody's dying. If you just ignore selection, you would estimate that true profile as the blue, and then people would be dying on top of that. So you're going to substantially underestimate the increase in frailty with age, the average increase. At the same time, you're also going to dramatically underestimate the persistence of frailty, right? So the shape of the variance profile is what pins down the persistence. So the higher the persistence, the closer we are to linear. And if you go, to greater than 1, the rho is greater than 1 in the AR process. It's a non-stationary process. You're going to get a convex shape here. And so you can see that if you just estimate the health process off of the observed frailty, ignoring selection, you're going to get a much lower value of rho, the persistence parameter. And the other thing you can see here is that our process is very, very persistent. It's basically close to like unit root. Okay. So now let me talk about how we estimate the impacts of health on productivity, controlling for selection. So like I said, we're going to do this separately for each education group. And now we're going to allow productivity to depend on age polynomial and a quadratic frailty effect, and then a fixed effect and an AR1 shock. And so we're going to estimate these processes, again, using the dynamic panel estimator, but now doing a selection correction following a procedure in a paper by Al Sadoun and co-authors that basically talk about how to do selection correction in dynamic panel models. And the selection correction requires an exclusion restriction. We're using the same exclusion restriction as Lowe and Pistafari use in a paper, which is potential government transfers. And at the end, what we find is, so before with correction, we find slightly larger impacts of frailty on wages, which is what you would expect. For high school dropouts, 1 additional deficit reduces wages by 4.4%. For high school graduates, it's 2.7 on average. We actually find the quadratic effects, interestingly, for the non-college are not statistically significant. So these are basically the effects of frailty on health are basically linear for them. College looks completely different. College, there's no effect of frailty on wages if you're below the 76th percentile of the frailty distribution. And then what happens is, as you move up above the 76th percentile, the effect is increasing at an increasing rate. And for example, if you're at the 95th percentile, 1 additional deficit reduces your wages by 2.8%. Okay, so now we talk about how we use the model to disentangle the effects that are operating through the disutility of work channel from the DI probability channel. So what we do is, in the calibration, when we're targeting, we're going to target a bunch of moments, doing like a simulated method of moments with the model and the data. And included in those moments are the DI recipiency rates by age and frailty for individuals 25 to 64. And then we're going to target labor force participation rates by age and frailty, but we're going to target them not only for prime age, but also for 65 to 74-year-olds. And then finally, we're going to target the relative DI acceptance rate by number of years you've been trying. Because like I said, this is something that we want the model to match well, because this really impacts the costs of trying to get on DI. And so that the reason we're targeting these labor force participation rates of these 65 to 74-year-olds is because this allows us to disentangle this disutility effect from this DI probability effect, because the variation in labor force participation by frailty for people 65 to 74 is not affected by the probabilities of getting on DI. It was not directly affected. And so this variation allows us to pin down separately how frailty impacts the disutility of work from how it impacts the probability of getting on DI. And so here's the moments that we target. We focus the calibration, or we focus the moments in the tail of the frailty distribution, because that's where all the action is. So for example, this is the fraction of people on SSDI in the 0 to 50th percentile of the frailty distribution by age, and this is their labor force participation. The next line is 50 to 70. Basically, below the 70th percentile of frailty, no matter what age, there's just no effects. They're virtually the same. You don't really start to see effects until you move up into this thin upper tail of really poor health. And you can see that as you move further and further up, the differences in the probability of being on DI and participating in the labor market just get bigger and bigger. Yeah.
Just clarification, this is the percentile rankings are unconditional across all ages? Or is there these age specific?
Oh, these are percentile rankings within age groups, I believe. Yep. Yeah, this is percentile within the age group. Okay. So this is the fit of the model. So you can see that the model matches well the patterns from the data, and in particular for these kind of 65 to 74-year-olds, we're matching well, the dispersion in their labor force participation rates by frailty, and which is, like I said, what's really pinning down how the disutility from working is varying with frailty in the model. And we find that the DI probability, both the probability of getting on DI and the disutility from work, have to be increasing in frailty at a convex rate, right? And that's because of this, like I said, this growing dispersion. Yep. Oh, DI. So yeah. So Social Security disability insurance, the benefit function is identical to old age Social Security. It depends on your past labor earnings. It's just a function of your past earnings. But SSI, if you're under 65 and you're disabled, you can get SSI if you meet a means test. So it's income and asset testing. So we have both here in the model. Okay, so it's benefits are declining in average earnings, just like Social Security, old age Social Security. But in addition, if your income and assets fall below a different level, you're guaranteed a consumption floor by the DI program. That's the way we're modeling it.
Yeah, I'm sorry to harp on about this point, but so if we compare, say, ages 60 to 64 to 45 to 49, the fact that we see people at the very top more likely to be SSDI, that could be because they're sicker, the top 5%, or is it because at the same level of frailty, they're more likely to be on SSDI?
So to be honest, I can't remember for sure if these are frailty conditional or not, and it's possible that they're actually not. I need to double check.
Yeah, it's just I'm just trying to filter out the cup.
Yeah, I should be able to remember, but right now I can't actually remember. So I'm trying to think. If you give me a second, I might be able to. I think they are age specific, but yeah. So part of the reason would be that they're in worse health.
Right.
Yes, I think that's correct. But I'll double check afterwards. I can let you know. Okay. I'm going to show you. We have an experiment where we look at. I'm not sure if this will answer your question or not, but people do get rejected in the model, and we look at the impacts on their future labor force participation, and we compare it to estimates in the literature. So when I get there, maybe when I get there, if I haven't, it doesn't answer your question, then you can ask me again. Okay, so here's the DI acceptance rates in the model and the data. So we match this well as well. Okay, so then to assess the model, we do two things. First, we look at kind of how the fraction of the dispersion in fraction of people on DI with frailty and age varies across education groups in the model and the data. So these are non-targeted, and the model does a good job of matching and at the decline in dispersion of people on DI across, within the frailty distribution as you move to the higher education groups. Same thing with labor force participation. The model matches well the fact that, within the college group, you see less dispersion in labor force participation across the frailty distribution. And then, so this is, Svetlana, what I was talking about. So another exercise we do with the model as assessment is we look at the impact of DI benefit denial on labor force participation in the model, and we compare it to empirical estimates from different papers in the empirical literature that have worked to estimate this effect. And we actually find in the model, so for 25 to 64-year-olds, 31% of individuals who are denied DI benefits in their first year of application are working 3 years later in the model. For 35 to 64, it's 28%, and for 45 to 64, it's 26%. And then these are estimates. I kind of line them up in the columns where they're more comparable based on the sample that was used for the estimation. But you can basically see that our estimates seem to be pretty reasonable given the estimated probabilities in the empirical literature. Okay. And so let's go on to how much, 5 minutes? Yeah, I should keep going. Okay, so then finally, in the quantitative exercise, so we want to understand the impact of health inequality on lifetime earnings inequality. So we're going to consider a counterfactual economy where everyone has the same average frailty profile. So in this counterfactual economy, we're going to remove all cross-sectional variation in frailty due to everything except age, right? So it's just going to be, you're going to get the average frailty of your age group at each age. And then we're going to look at the impact of doing this on lifetime earnings inequality by age. And by lifetime earnings, what we mean is the sum of all earnings up to that age. Our measure of inequality is the variance of log. And so here's the results. So you can see that this is the baseline. This is the economy where everybody has the average frailty profile. You can see that starting around age 40, giving everyone the average frailty profile leads to lower lifetime earnings. By age 65, the difference between the benchmark and the economy where there's no frailty heterogeneity is 30%, right? And so this is where I get that headline number. 30% of lifetime earnings inequality at age 65 is due to health inequality. Okay, and then we look at the different channels. So to do this, we're going to do a series of counterfactual experiments where in each counterfactual, we're going to effectively shut down the impact of health heterogeneity on individuals through that channel. And so, for example, in counterfactual number 1, we use the average frailty profile to determine your probability of getting DI. So it's equivalent to the baseline in all other respects, except that when we go to calculate your probability of getting on DI, we're going to use the average frailty profile. And then in counterfactual 2, equivalent to the baseline, except now to determine your probability, your labor productivity, we're going to use the average frailty profile, and so on. What do we find? Well, first we find that these 3 lower channels are not very important for the result. The primary channels are the DI channel and the labor productivity channel. The DI channel, at very young ages, it actually increases inequality, and then at older ages, it reduces inequality and the effects get larger and larger. I'll show you a picture that explains why in 1 second. Labor productivity, using the average frailty profile to determine people's wages, basically, reduces lifetime earnings inequality, which should not be surprising. Yeah, and I just want to make one quick point, which is that all of the impacts here are in the top of the frailty distribution. So like I said, for 0 to 50, there's nothing going on in the model. Consistent with what I showed you for the data, that labor force participation rates don't vary in the model. for people across these experiments for the 0 to 50th percentile groups. This is the top 5% most frail individuals in each age group. And what you can see, so this is their labor force participation in the benchmark. This is their labor force participation when we remove all frailty heterogeneity. This is their labor force participation when we just use the average frailty profile to determine their probability of getting on DI, which basically means they have close to 0 probability of getting on DI. And you can see, like I said, at very young ages, this actually reduces lifetime earnings inequality. And this is because individuals, this is because highly frail young individuals, if they know that they no longer have a high probability of qualifying on DI, they actually are less willing to work because there's an incentive effect for these guys to work to accumulate earnings to increase their future DI benefits. And once that incentive effect is gone, they just go directly on means-tested programs. And then at older ages, you can see that labor force participation is actually higher when you remove this channel. And this is because, like I said, for older frail individuals, now now they have less an incentive to drop out of the labor force because they can't get the DI benefits. Okay, and then that's productivity, but am I out of time, basically? 2 minutes, so let me quickly talk about the welfare effects. So then, we found that health inequality has a large impact on lifetime earnings inequality, and that the largest channel driving that relationship is the fact that these individuals on poor health have higher probability of getting on Social Security, disability insurance, and SSI. So then we say, well, if this is the case, maybe we should get rid of this program. Maybe it's a bad program. It's contributing to lifetime earnings inequality. And so we say, what happens if we get rid of it in the model? And so here's the welfare results of removing the program. So if you just do this in partial equilibrium, so you remove the SSDI, SSI benefits, and you remove all the payroll taxes that finance them, but you don't otherwise adjust the government budget, welfare actually declines by 1.2%. Not surprisingly, the people who are the most unhappy about this are the less educated because they're the primary beneficiaries. The program is redistributive. They also have worse health, so they value more the insurance component. College are actually happy because they're the primary payers of the program. If you do it in general equilibrium, in this economy with no DI, there's a higher fraction of people relying on the other social insurance programs like the means-tested transfers. So income taxes would have to go up, right? This makes people even more unhappy about the removal of the program. Or alternatively, you could lower the consumption floor and really screw the less educated people, and then they're really unhappy. And then as a final thing, what we do is we say, okay, there's these two channels, right? As I just described, these welfare results are really driven by two channels: the loss of redistribution from better health people to worse health people and higher earnings people to lower earnings people, and the loss of insurance against the risk of getting hit with these bad health shocks. And so then we want to understand how important are these two channels. So what we try to do is remove the redistribution channel. I mean, we don't fully remove it, but we remove it by shutting down redistribution across education, which is a huge part of the redistribution here. And so to do that, we consider an alternative world where DI is self-financed within each education group. So now high school graduates finance their own DI program. The budget has to clear only for them. College finance their own. High school dropouts finance their own. And what we find is kind of interesting. We find that, first we find that about 2/3, for high school dropouts, about 2/3 of the welfare benefits are from redistribution. So without redistribution, their welfare falls by much less. And 1/3 of the welfare benefits for high school graduates is from redistribution. And then, I'm sorry, this is if we do this in partial equilibrium. Notice what happens if we do this in general equilibrium. So first, when we get rid of redistribution, the college graduates are actually happier, right? So their welfare goes up relative to no DI. And this is because college graduates actually value the insurance benefits of this program. So you take away the redistribution component and, they're actually happier about that. But that's if you do this in partial equilibrium. If you then now go and clear the government budget, everybody is worse off. And the reason is that essentially in general equilibrium, the college graduates can't escape the redistribution, because now you've taken away redistribution in DI, but these high school dropouts and high school graduates, they just utilize heavier these general means tested social insurance programs. And so those programs still have to be financed. Income taxes have to go up, and income taxes are more distortionary and even more progressive than the payroll taxes. And so the college graduates hate them even more than financing this through payroll taxes. And the net effect is that you're actually worse off. You know, in particular, college graduates are worse off than if you just left the DI program the way it was. Okay, and I'm done. So yeah, so we basically find that there's large responses of earnings to changes in frailty, mostly driven by participation. There's also some wage effects. And then we build the model. We find that health inequality accounts for 30% of lifetime earnings inequality at age 65, primarily due to the presence of the Social Security, Disability, and SSI programs. Yet these programs are welfare improving. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you to the organizer for inviting to me to discuss this paper. It was really a very nice paper. A lot of work because they did like 2 papers really, because they are the empirical part that she didn't stop too much time, but they did a lot of robustness check and it's very extensive. And also the modeling that she just presented, and you see, I see this model like a very nice model to explain the low income distribution in the bottom. Then I like a lot the paper. Then just very fast, because she explained very well. Even she did a bit presentation, and I structured them very good. That the Karen presented is they want to know the effect of health on the labor supply outcome, like earnings, hours, and wages, and in particular to quantify the impact of health inequality of lifetime earnings inequality. And you saw they use a frailty index, very important, it's a forthcoming paper, and they have 27 health conditions. And they are like 3 dimensions, not because they are the activities of daily living, cognitive scores, and health condition. I agree with the fact that maybe to introduce self-reported could be good for the younger, but they have 27 indicators. And then they have this huge part of empirical fact that is done with the PISA-ID, where they see the relationship between earnings and health. And finally, they are right to say, okay, it's very important to understand how is working these health inequalities in the low income distribution for health people and low educated people. Then they try to build, I think, the model in terms that to explain this part. And to do that, they do this extensive model, the life cycle models in general equilibrium to explain health inequality on the lifetime earnings inequality. And they calibrate and they do the simulated method moment with data from PISA-ID, HRS, and MEPS. Then there is a lot of work in this kind of work, as you know. Then for the summary in the empirical part, they saw that this fragility decreased labor productivity and the probability of labor force participation. Then it's because that I think they try to focus on the model to these people, no? Then they do the modeling, and they individuals can choose to work, not working, or apply for disability insurance. And when they arrive at retirement age, they decide to work or to retire, but they cannot come back to work. The health affects the physicians in different channels, as she mentioned. Then probability of a successful disability application, labor productivity, mortality, out-of-pocket expenses, and the utility of work. And then conclude, and I am happy that I choose that you remark the fact that health inequality is an important source of lifetime earnings inequality, in particular at older ages. And the main channels are the 2 first ones, the probability of the successful disability application and the labor productivity. Then I don't go to this, but the important thing is that they find a significant impact of health on earnings, but they don't find impact of earnings on health. Then I want to do some questions and suggestions because as I said, they did thousands of robustness. Then I try to do a bit brainstorming what other robustness checks could do. And one of the things that I was more worried is the labor market heterogeneity. In terms that if we are interested in low-income people, for example, race, the probability to claim disability or social insurance programs are not the same for different races in US states. Or gender, single mothers, for example, they are used to claim this program more. Other thing is the self-employment, for example, are different variants in labor income that salary workers or part-time versus full-time. Then this kind of aspect that are labor market heterogeneity, how can affect the results in the empirical part. And it's just, I think, just to check if you could do the most important groups that are you think that can be a bias, to do just a robustness check with this sample could be, and to see if really they are the same kind of impact of the quantity varies. Other important thing for me is the different cohort that Daniel already mentioned. Why? Because we are talking about lifetime earnings, and then that means that the different people that they born in different moments of the time. Then these people have different medical programs. It's not the same the people who born in 1940 than the people who born in 1990. Or they have different, for example, education proportion. The people didn't educate in college education in proportion in the older cohort compared to the younger ones. And then this is, I think it's very important. For the PISA-ID, you could check for the younger, for people who are 25 in 1980, and they will arrive around 59 for the waves of 2019. And for the elderly, you should use the HRS, and if you want to check if this is very important or not. Other important thing that I think for my macro part, is the other is more my micro. The one that is more macro is the growth. How important is the growth? Because the different growth is not the same. The exposure in the economic growth at macro level in terms of technology for the older cohorts than the younger ones. For example, there are this paper of Lakatos and Benjamin Moll and co-authors that they show that when we look at lifetime earning, we should care about that. Then this is something that, one thing that you could check is just to do cohorts, checking the cohort. The other thing is the part of health. What is the items that brings more health inequality? Then maybe you could check just doing free components. For example, memory components are not the same that daily limitation or body mass or chronic condition. Then you can maybe do a kind of 2-free index in terms to see what is the one that brings this inequality. The fact that you don't have impact of earnings on health is very interesting, because I am very interested on that, because when I read the motivation for the frailty index, I like it. They say there is an accumulation of things that happens in your past, in your health. But I was thinking, yes, but when we do the regressions in the wages, we are not doing the same, because we are checking for the current wage. But what happens when there is accumulation of income variation? Maybe you cannot do with the PISA-ID, but it's just for further research that maybe we are looking at the wrong variable. Maybe we need to look, as you did with the health index, what happens when we have too many changes in your income, how affect your wealth, like, for example, job loss. In terms of modeling, I like it a lot, the model. I think it could be even, I think for the low income distribution, it's a very nice to see how health inequality can explain these people, no? This profile of these people. The only thing that is just a bit to understand, because I didn't understand, or because maybe you can improve, I didn't understand well the non-employed, because you use non-employed, but in the presentation you use unemployed. That is unemployed or non-employed? Because for me it was important in terms that, for example, in the non-employed are the unemployed and the non-labor force. People can transit from non-labor force to because they are in the social insurance programs, and they can go to unemployment, and then they go to work. Then the probability to find a job is different. Then it's not the same. The one that separate, because you estimate the separation of the employment working to unemployment in the normal market, but maybe going from non-labor force to unemployment or unemployment to disability, there are other kind of probabilities. Then it was not clear for me the transitions in between the decisions in the market. Other small issue, but maybe just to explain, I imagine that you don't modelize retired because it's to come back to work, because it's more complicated. But however, there are this paper of Nicole Maestra that they says that is very important, the proportion is quite important, and they used to be low-income people that come back to work because they need to work. Then how important is this proportion, or if it's not important, it will be overestimate or underestimate. I imagine that it will improve your results, but this is just by intuition. And I didn't understand well the health insurance, because how people is insured is clear for the older, but for the people, for example, the unemployed, the non-labor force are insured because you are missing different cohorts. There are people who were not uninsured all their lives, for example. Then how is important, and if it's in the low income distribution, maybe they are insured with the Medicaid program. Then this kind of things is not clear in the paper, and I think given that you are focusing in this part of the population could be interesting. And other thing is, I realized that I will do is the calibration for the model, that why to focus in the whole population, given that there are all this labor heterogeneity, or maybe I don't know, but why for the model you use the main calibration, and for the motivation the wall is something that could be interesting. And the other thing is just for presentation to understand the identification in the second stage parameters, that now you saw a little bit, but to see well what brings what, because at the end I was a bit missed what it was the parameter, but this is more technical. And the welfare, to see your equations, it will be important. And just to finish like that, I let people to ask questions. They are for interpreting the result, no? Because in your model, the result is the health inequality is a major contributor to inequality in lifetime earnings. However, if I go, this is in your model, because it's more focused in the low income distribution, then I am sure that this is very important for this. But when we go to the world population, I am not so sure that this will be the mechanism. When you go to the literature, is maybe a human capital life cycle model with education, non-connectivity abilities, genetic. And this is more brainstorming. I think it's very important to understand all these patterns, to understand what happened in our early life, because maybe the income when we are 25 is not important, but maybe the income of the parents are very important in order to educate, and then to have a good education, and then they will affect to your lifetime earnings for your life. Then if that is all, then I thank you very much, and I enjoy your paper. It's really nice.